Mark Goldwine is the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, where he guides and conducts research on a wide array of topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget. He is frequently quoted in a number of major media outlets and works regularly with members of Congress and their staffs on budget-related issues. In addition to his work at the committee, Mark serves on Martha's Table's Business Advisory Council and teaches economics at Johns Hopkins University and the University of California, DC. Mark is the recipient of the Johns Hopkins University Excellence in Teaching Award and was featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 list for law and policy. He holds a BA and an MA from Johns Hopkins University. I will leave the content to the experts, but to suffice it to say, we're really excited about the timing of tonight's program. To guide our conversation, I have the pleasure to welcome Hank Gutman. Hank's a familiar face to many in our community as the Bravo Vail board chair, but in his professional career, he has over 45 years of tax experience and expertise, including in the federal government and congressional positions, as well as teaching at the University of Virginia and the University of Pennsylvania. We have excellent institutions cornered, gentlemen. He has great experience in working with the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees to develop tax legislation and has served as the Deputy Legislative Counsel in the Treasury Department. He's worked closely with Dale Mosier on pulling this program together, and we'll let Hank get us started. Please welcome back to the Vail Symposium, Hank Gutman.
Thank you. Are we on? Good. Can you hear me? Beth, can you hear me? Okay. I have a target here. I want to make sure that Beth can hear this. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Who knew about the timing, huh? I mean, when we were trying to plan this, we had no idea whether we were talking about being shut down or exactly what's going on. But as Ken said, Congress got their act together, sort of, and passed what's called a continuing resolution on Saturday. And a continuing resolution is basically a piece of legislation that allows government spending to go on at specified levels. And this continuing resolution will last through November 17. So a little bit later, maybe we can talk about what happens on November 15 or 16. But in the meantime, you have chaos in the House, so who knows exactly where we're going to be. One of the things I would like to emphasize about at least the beginning of this program is our attempt to make this as objective as we can. People have strong views about some of these things. We're going to try and make this as objective as we can. The entity with whom Mark works, the CRFB, is absolutely hands down the most important and most neutral, in my view, arbitrator or prognosticator or commentator on budgetary issues. Their board of directors is extraordinarily diverse, both sides of the aisle. Their staff is superb, and they carry no political agenda. And so particularly in a context like this, it's very important that we recognize who it is that we're talking things over with. And I can tell you that, at least from my experience, you're not going to be able to get much more objective in terms of what's going on. You might not like what you hear, but you're going to hear it objectively. So, let's see, where are the slides? You want to use me? So I want to just lay out a little bit of background here. Mark's going to get into much more of the detail, but the entire budget process and who the players are is really not particularly well known to the general public. In the Congress, there are really two entities, one that deals with revenues and the other that deals with spending. And the side that deals with spending is called the Congressional Budget Office. And the side that deals with revenues, by the way, is called the Joint Committee on Taxation. And we can talk about them later if you want. The Joint Committee on Taxation is what I was in charge of for a number of years. The CBO deals, as I say, with the spending side of things. They are absolutely nonpartisan. I want to put that out on the table now. We can talk about what that means later as well. But they provide the best objective information that we can have, and more importantly, almost, what they say is what governs what Congress can do. That's the really important thing. You might not like some of the things that, for example, revenue estimates that are made by the Joint Committee on Taxation. Certainly when I worked there, I never saw a member of Congress who thought that we had scored anything right. Never raised as much money as they thought it should raise, and it always lost more money than they thought it should lose. But there are objective people here doing objective things. Now, one of the important things that CBO does annually, and then it updates it, is it does a long-range budget outlook. And all of these things are accessible online. You can go to cbo.gov and get them. And I thought it would be good just to set the stage for what we're talking about by looking at CBO's long-range budget outlook that was just published in June. Because this is really very revealing stuff. And you look at the major variables that CBO has here, and here we're talking about revenues and outlays. Okay, so revenues are individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other. And in the outlays, we have two major categories of outlays. One are mandatory outlays. Those are things like Social Security and those funded expenditures. And then we have also discretionary spending. And so we want to look at what CBO thinks is going to happen. And these numbers are as a percentage of gross domestic product. So you can look at this and you can see one of the interesting things is the revenue line. The revenue line basically stays pretty constant at around 19%, or slightly over 19% of revenue, which historically is high, by the way. Historically, that's high. And you can look at the composition of that, and I'll leave this to you all to sort of sort through as to where these revenues are coming from. The trajectory is that basically they are going up, but not significantly. Outlays are also laid out in terms, both as I said, of mandatory, that's Social Security and healthcare programs, and discretionary. Discretionary is what they vote on all the time, every year. Mandatory, that money's got to come out. And Mark's going to talk an awful lot about, if we really want to get this under control, how are we going to do it? Because this is reality. People can do a lot of this, but there's reality and there are constraints in the process that limit the ability to do things. But what we see here is that the outlay total is projected to rise through 2043, and so is the revenue total, but the differential between the two shows that outlays are going to outpace revenues. So that if we think we have a deficit problem now, it's not going to get better. On these projections, it's going to continue to get worse. And you can see that on the deficit total line of what's going on, with deficit increases to 8.1% of GDP in 2043 and 10% of GDP in 2053. And this is a really ugly picture. This is a very ugly picture. So that sets the sort of the economic outlook or background. Which one? This one? There?
The right hand.
Right one? Okay. So when these projections are made, CBO has to come up with the variables that are going to be input into their computer models in order to be able to produce the slide that we just saw. And this is very important stuff to look at, actually. The CBO economic projections break down into important categories. What's going to happen to gross domestic product? What do we think is going to happen with inflation? What about unemployment rates? And what about interest rates? All of these are critically important components that get built into what we just saw. And if you look at this is sort of an interesting picture. It's a mixed picture. For example, the inflation rate is pretty stable and actually meant to go down. And it's at 3%. Some freaked out that it was going to be a lot higher than that, but the projection is that that's at 3%. GDP growth, though, if we look at growth, real GDP growth, that is, in an understatement, anemic, okay? That is not a good picture on the GDP growth side of things. Inflation looks to be rather stable. We keep talking about, are we going to fall apart here? Is the entire economy going to fall apart? The CBO is projecting that things are not going to be too bad on the inflation side. The unemployment rate is interesting because the unemployment rate is a little high from where it's been historically, I think, Mark. It's 3.8, it's a little bit higher than it's been recently, but that's doable. Mm-hmm. That's a doable rate. And then we look at the Treasury bills, and here's where you have all kinds of issues that arise. Short-term Treasury bills, the rate is projected to be in the neighborhood of 4.9 to 5.1. Long-term Treasury bills, 4.1. I think there are many who'd say that's pretty optimistic, but some might say. And that, by the way, has a huge effect on things when we start talking about where it is that we really have to worry about what happens over the longer term. The interest cost that's associated with all of these deficits at interest rates like this are really quite frightening, and so they pose a challenge that Mark will talk about in terms of dealing with that. So that's sort of the big picture. I want to do just two little process things that might be helpful to people. We've had this issue of the debt ceiling that we've all talked about. What's that all about? Well, the debt ceiling defines the amount of money that the federal government may borrow. And basically, it's not to fund future stuff. These are obligations we've got, and we've got to pay. So Congress has set a limit on how much money can be borrowed. And when you get right up to that limit, as we did, things get very frightening. Because if you can't borrow any more money to pay your debts, how are you going to pay your debts? So the debt ceiling is incurred, as I said, an important point is that it's used to pay for stuff that's already been passed. This isn't future stuff. The current debt limit, we went up against the wall with this. The current debt limit has been suspended through January 1st, 2025. So we've got wiggle room in here. And that was done by legislation that was enacted in June. That legislation didn't just deal with the debt ceiling, but it also projected a $1.5 trillion reduction in otherwise projected benefits. In other words, there were spending cuts that were associated with this. And that was part of the deal that had to be made to get the thing passed. And the $1.5 trillion of deficit reduction that comes out of this bill comes from a cap on discretionary spending. There was a lot of money that was provided in response to COVID that was unspent. They took that back. There were some modifications of work requirements for some of the low-income welfare programs. And then, since the IRS is everybody's punching bag, the Congress had appropriated $80 billion to the IRS. They took some of that money back. So that's basically what it did. One thing that I think is interesting, and Mark maybe can talk a little bit about how important it is how big is our debt and who owns it? Who owns our debt? So these are April figures, and I guess the number that I saw just said we just went over 33 trillion.
We did.
We just went over 33 trillion. So in April...
Happy birthday.
Yeah. In April, it wasn't that high. But these are still roughly the right distributions of who owns the debt. So public debt, that's the stuff that's owned by people in the public, is almost $24.5 trillion. But it's interesting because a not insignificant amount of that is held by foreign holders. And one of the things you want to sort of think about is that debt is going to come due. It's going to have to be paid off. And are we going to be able to go back to the same markets to get money? And if we do, at what cost? And this is one of those issues where do we have a risk of any substantial amount when this debt expires and who's going to buy it and what are they going to demand from us. And so I focused just a little bit on the foreign ownership just to see that there is leverage there. Not in the grand scheme of things, it's not huge as a percentage of our total debt, but specifically it can become a problem. Then the other debt, the other debt is money that has been borrowed by the federal government from the Social Security Fund and the other mandatory funds. And these are from other government agencies. Currently, Social Security, for example, is running a current surplus. And, I mean, that's going to go away. But currently, it's a current surplus. And so the federal government borrows money from the trust funds in order to be able to finance operations. And so a picture of what our debt, the scope of our debt is important to understand in terms not only of just its magnitude, but also where the pressure points are. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the budget process, because that's, of course, what we've been in, all right? So you probably might be surprised to know that there was something called the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 that actually specified what ought to happen in terms of how the budget is determined. So this isn't part of the Budget Act, but what is meant to happen is the president proposes the president proposes his budget, and then the congressional committees examine that. And what's supposed to happen is that there's 12 specific funding bills that have to be dealt with. So those are the appropriations bills, and they're sliced up into defense, health, and all of those things. 12 committees in both houses are supposed to be dealing with that. And they deal with it in the context of something called a budget resolution, which is not law, but basically is precatory in terms of what the country ought to be spending in the next fiscal year. So you get a budget resolution, and then when it's working the way it should work, the appropriators then go into their little niche and they spend the money that has been allocated to them in the budget resolution. What a dream. I thought it had happened 7 times since March 1997, but Mark told me it's only happened twice.
Well, it's happened late more times than that, but it's only happened on time.
On time, twice. So this is a process that exists, but it exists more in how it's not used rather than how it is used. And so when we read about all the turmoil that's going on in the budget process, we need to think about it in terms of there actually is something here that lays out a guideline, but there's no enforcement mechanism, and consequently, the members of Congress are left on their own to develop essentially the budget. And they were unable to do it this year. They've been unable to do it in the past. We have a continuing resolution that keeps spending at a certain level, and then come the beginning or end of November, the beginning or middle of November, we're going to be back in this story again. So that's by way of background. Now you need to hear from somebody who can actually tell you something.
You already heard my bio a couple times, but I want to make a few things clear. First of all, I was 30 under 30 12 years ago, okay? So I'm not quite as young as I look. The second is, as Hank said, and thank you for that intro about the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Every think tank is nonpartisan because the law says they have to be nonpartisan. But the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, my organization, we are actually nonpartisan. Our three co-chairs, are Leon Panetta, who was Democratic chair of the Budget Committee, Secretary of Defense under President Obama, Chief of Staff of Bill Clinton. It's Tim Penny, who is a former congressman and independent, and it's Mitch Daniels, who is Republican, OMB director under Bush and a governor. And our board disagrees on all sorts of things, like the size of government and what the tax code should look like. But Hank's not quite right, because we do have one political view, which is we don't think the deficit should be out of control. We're not even a balanced budget group, but we are a group that thinks that at some point you're borrowing too much and you probably shouldn't do that. And so We serve a few functions. We are a watchdog. Congress likes to, and the president, they like very much to say they are fiscally responsible, but they don't like to actually be fiscally responsible, right? And we're there to kind of bridge the gap to say, we know that they're saying they're fiscally responsible, but those numbers don't add up. So part of what we do is a watchdog role. Part of what we do is advocacy. We push for deficit reduction, for reforms to fix various trust funds, to make the tax code more competitive, to reduce lower healthcare costs, all of those things. Part of what we do is help members of Congress. We offer technical assistance as they're working their way through legislation. They're trying to figure out how to pay for their policies or how to understand what's going on. And then lastly, most importantly, we have an education role. Most of what we do is write papers and blogs and other analyses that take these 80-page CBO reports and turn them into an 8-page paper or a 2-page blog that very busy Hill staff, that very busy journalists can understand and digest. And we produce our own analysis on top of that. Something that analysis shows over and over again is that this country is not in a good fiscal position. So Hank gave some of the long-term numbers, but let me just give you the this year number. This year's deficit, the fiscal year ended October 1, so it ended yesterday, right? So last year now. Last year's deficit, when we account for some weird accounting things related to debt cancellation, was $2 trillion. $2 trillion. That is double the amount of the 2022 deficit of $1 trillion. So the budget deficit, how much we are borrowing annually, has doubled between last year and this year. Prior to the pandemic, $1 trillion was normal. Now, to me, that already seemed pretty high, $1 trillion. But $1 trillion was what we were borrowing before the pandemic. And we thought that, we borrowed $3 trillion a year for all the things that you're very aware of, PPP, checks, unemployment, all the sorts of the COVID relief. But when we were at $1 trillion in 2022, we thought, okay, we're back to the old normal. That's too high, but we can deal with it. Turns out, 2022 was actually a really good year. We benefited from a huge one-time surge in revenue and other things. $2 trillion is their new normal. That's where we are now. And that's added right onto the debt. Now, as economists, $33 trillion is like a nice way to talk about it in a press release, but as economists, we look at the national debt relative to the size of the economy. That's the same thing you would do in your household, right? If you're making $1 million a year and you have a $200,000 mortgage, no big deal. If you're making $20,000 a year and you have $1 million mortgage, that's a problem, right? Same thing for the federal government. We can afford to borrow. The United States government can borrow. We don't need to pay off our debt. We don't even need to balance our budget. But what we do need is a debt that is sustainable relative to the size of the economy. And economists generally think that means it should be shrinking, not growing, relative to GDP. So your economy should be growing faster than your debt is. That is, of course, not the case. Throughout our history, debt has gone up and down. Usually it's gone up during war and recessions. It's gone down otherwise. You can see we last peaked right after World War II at about 106% of GDP. We are very close to that now. Within a few years, debt, 2029 is CBO's projections. I think it'll be sooner. But within a few years, debt is going to exceed that World War II record. Except for not because of a war buildup, not because of a Great Depression, just because we're kind of doing the things normally and they're very expensive and we have no plan to pay for them. After that, things just get worse. Excuse me. So CBO has, the Congressional Budget Office has what is called its baseline. This is sort of its base case scenario. In its base case scenario, it thinks within 30 years, debt is going to roughly double to 180% of GDP. This is completely unprecedented in the United States. It is very unusual around the world. Only really Japan. Japan's the only country in the world of significant wealth that has sustained a level of debt that high. And they haven't had any economic growth in basically 30 years. That's assuming, this is a generous scenario, because this assumes that all the tax cuts we passed in 2017 that expire at 2025 are allowed to expire. It assumes that we keep appropriations under control. If you relax some of those assumptions, if you assume Congress basically acts as they have historically, debt hockey sticks. It goes past 250%, at which point CBO says, that's too high, we don't even want to estimate it, right? So it goes literally right off their chart. Debt is rising very rapidly. What are the consequences of this in the near term? It's an inflation contributor, right? When we borrowed $3 trillion a year for 2 years for COVID, some of that was really important money, was really meaningful to keep household balance sheets strong, to keep businesses open. But there were consequences. And the consequences were when the economy reopened, when people started getting vaccines in their arm and things started to normalize, people had a ton of money to spend. And they were trying to spend it into an economy that wasn't really didn't have the capacity to bear it, right? It was an economy that still had high unemployment, and people went out and they wanted to spend their checks, and they went right to the used car dealership, and so car prices spiked, right? And then we actually saw that through basically every sector in the economy. So huge deficits can cause high inflation, and that's what we saw in the last couple of years. It's just now coming down. We're still 3.5% inflation over the last year, which is almost twice the target amount, but at least we're moving in the right direction. We were at 7%. High deficits can cause inflation. High deficits also mean high interest spending, right? Just like you pay interest on a credit card or a mortgage, the US pays interest on its debt. Luckily for us, we've borrowed mostly when interest rates were really low. If you go back a couple years, the interest rate on the 3-month bond was like 0.2%. And even on the 10-year treasury, it was 2% or so. Now, today, the 10-year treasury closed at 4.7%. That's the highest rate we've seen in 16 years. The 3-month is at 5.5%. And so we have very high interest rates on very high debt. And that means interest costs are rising rapidly. Last year, I keep forgetting we're on October 2nd now. Last year, the federal government spent more in interest than everything it did on children. So you add together the child tax credit, K through 12 education, the CHIP program, child health insurance, child nutrition, school lunches, etc. We were spending more in interest, more to service our past than invest in our future. By next year, got that right now, by 2024, we will probably be spending more in interest than on national defense. And within 20 years, interest is on course to be the single largest government program, bigger than Social Security, bigger than Medicare, bigger than defense. Those high interest rates, those high interest payments, that debt issuance, people are buying that debt instead of investing in the private sector. And over time, that does something that we call in economics crowd out. Essentially, when somebody buys a government bond, they're buying it instead of investing in productive, in the productive private sector. And for 1 year, that doesn't mean a lot, but over time, that starts to erode growth. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that if we continue our trend growth, income per person will be about $125,000 in 30 years. That's in today's dollars. But if debt is rising out of control, it'll be 110%. So it's basically up to a third of our expected economic growth will be eaten away as a result of rising debt. Maybe a sixth if we're in that scenario where we assume Congress all of a sudden doesn't do irresponsible things. It's a very big assumption. And by the way, I haven't even talked about our major trust funds. Several government programs are self-financed. The Highway Trust Fund is paid for out of the gas tax. Medicare Part A, the hospital insurance, is paid out of payroll tax. Social Security also paid out of payroll tax. That payroll tax is no longer enough to cover benefits. We do have all those savings in the Social Security Trust Fund, but those are being depleted fast. And in fact, by 2033 or so, Social Security will be out of reserves. Now, that doesn't mean Social Security goes away, but what it does mean under the law is that Social Security can only pay for what it's bringing in revenue. That's a 23% across the board cut for everyone. Doesn't matter if you're 62 or 102. Doesn't matter if you're low income or high income. Everybody gets a cut. For a new middle income couple retiring in 10 years, that's the equivalent of $17,400, right? So the law says their benefits are going to be cut $17,000 if Congress doesn't do anything to prevent that. I know I haven't depressed you enough, so let me just give you a couple more things, which is like, these are kind of optimistic scenarios in that they assume that we don't get stuck in some kind of debt spiral. Those CBO baseline numbers I showed you assume that interest rates are 4%, not 4.7% as they are now. The problem, that seems like a small difference, but it actually makes a big difference because when your interest rate is above your growth rate, your debt can start to pile on. And as your debt piles on, it's more interest payments, and it's lower economic growth, and it's higher interest rates. And those all feed into each other. And in the worst case scenario, they can kind of create this debt spiral feedback, which is what you see here. That would be bad. I mean, the ultimate consequence of this is there'd be a financial crisis at some point. If we weren't able to prevent this from happening, the only option would be a huge erosion of the debt and a financial crisis. I'm optimistic. I think we will stop this from happening, but it's not a guarantee. Plenty of other consequences, but let me just kind of move past that into the solutions, because I've already upset you enough. So now let me tell you that there is some hope, right? So high debt puts our trust funds in danger. It creates generational problems. It slows economic growth, boosts interest rate. It gives us less ability to borrow when we actually need to. It increased geopolitical risk, especially as China is our biggest holder of our debt. There's all sorts of reasons we should want to reduce our debt, but it's really hard. It's really hard because there really are only two solutions. You tax more or you spend less. And it turns out people don't like to pay more in taxes or get less in services or benefits, right? But that is Congress's job. That's their mandate. And they have a few areas of the budget they can look at. To give you a sense of what is needed, now, Washington's the only place in the world that we talk in 10-year numbers, but that's how we talk. Everything in Washington is budgeted on a 10-year basis. This causes huge problems in my home life, by the way, because when my wife and I are talking about like the cost of summer camp, I'm like, oh, it's only $3 billion, because my order of magnitude is totally messed up. You know, $1 trillion house in our neighborhood, but that's how we talk in budget. We talk in trillions over 10 years. In order to just keep debt to below the size of the economy, it would take $6 trillion of deficit reduction over the next decade. And so I think that's a reasonable target for policymakers. It means your debt isn't shrinking, they're not solving the problem, but your debt isn't growing, or it's not growing much more than now. So I think $6 trillion is a reasonable target. Some of them are talking about balancing the budget in 10 years. That would be $16 trillion. That is not a reasonable target. That would require cutting spending across the board or raising taxes by about 25 or 33%. That's not happening, especially with all the promises they've made. So $6 trillion, that would be really nice. Where can that come from? The most frequent place Congress looks to cut spending is from the appropriators. This is what they did in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. They looked at the appropriators. They saw, you guys are spending like drunken sailors, and they said, we're going to put some limits on it. So the way that the spending works, which Hank touched on, is most spending is on autopilot. It's Social Security is determined by formula, or Medicare that's based on how many services are collected, or food stamps, which is based on eligibility. But the defense budget and large things that you think of it as like core functions of government, like all the federal employees, the EPA, money to states for public education, Department of Interior, these are appropriated annually. And they're supposed to be appropriated based on the budget process. Congress passes a budget resolution, and then the appropriators know how much to spend. Congress hasn't really passed a real budget resolution in a very long time. So the next best thing is caps. Congress gives the appropriators caps, and then they spend to them. The last few years, there's been neither a budget nor caps, and so the appropriator said, we'll just spend whatever we want. And that's essentially what they've done. And Democrats and Republicans basically trade with each other. They say, okay, tell you what, we'll give you 8% more for non-defense if you give us 8% more for defense. And then the other person says, well, how about 12? I say, deal, right? So that's how it's worked. So it makes sense to put some limitations on that. That's what the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that's what the debt limit deal did. For 2 years, it said, we are going to put a limit on the appropriations. And you can kind of see that orange line is the limits they put, whereas that blue line was where we were headed. Those limits are only for this year and next year. And so far, by the way, it's not going well, because the House is trying to spend way below that limit, and the Senate's trying to spend above that limit. And then I guess the Speaker's going to be vacated tomorrow or something. So it's not going great, but historically, these have worked well. They worked well in the 90s. They worked well in the early 2010s. We should at least extend these, and we may want to think about even further limiting, because discretionary spending has gone up an awful lot since 2017. But there's limits to what we can do. This is essentially a quarter of the budget, right? And half of that is defense. So the part that like some people want to cut is 12% of the budget, right? So yeah, let's limit that. Let's not let that grow unsustainably, but we're not going to solve this looking at an eighth or a quarter of the budget. We're going to have to look to the big spending programs. And that's basically healthcare. The United States government spends about average on healthcare around the world. The difference is every other country, their healthcare covers all their citizens. We spend the same amount just to cover seniors and low income. Our total healthcare spending, private and public, is about twice the amount of sort of the average rich country. It's 50% more than the next largest country. We spend an awful lot on healthcare. And at the federal level, those costs are growing, mainly for Medicare, which is mostly for people over 65, but also for Medicaid, for the Obamacare subsidies, for children's health insurance. These costs are very high. The reason Medicaid looks like it's going down there is because we had some special pandemic expansion. So you're seeing the pandemic expansion phase out, and then it's going to start to rise again. But our healthcare costs, if you add them together, it's the biggest government line item. We have to get those under control. Fortunately, there are lots of options. I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is just sort of a set that CBO has. The good news about healthcare is also the bad news, which is that we spend it in an incredibly wasteful way. That's the good news because it means there's an incredible amount of savings that are possible from reducing waste. For just a couple of examples, if you get dialysis in a hospital, Medicare is paying way more than if you get the exact same dialysis at a dialysis center. Same is true for most kinds of healthcare. Medicare pays more for hospitals. Even for hospital-owned private doctors' clinics, they're paying more. So just equalizing that payment, this is something that like Elizabeth Warren and Newt Gingrich agree on. This is broadly understood. Hospitals don't like it, but everybody else does. As another example, there's a private alternative to Medicare called Medicare Advantage, many of you may know of. These plans in many ways are more efficient than Medicare, and yet they cost the federal government way more because of how they code their patients. They make them look riskier, and because of the quality bonus program that everybody gets. It's like, I don't know if everyone's seen the movie Incredibles, but it's like everybody's special, so nobody is. So there's a lot we can do just to fix those payments to save money. One more example is states are basically scamming the federal government out of Medicaid money. They go to a hospital and they say, tell you what, we're going to increase your payments by $100 and we're going to tax you $100, or we're going to tax you $90. You'll be $10 better off, but we're going to tell the feds we spend an extra $100 and get a bigger match. This game has proliferated to an incredible degree. So there's a ton we can do to save money in healthcare, in Medicare and Medicaid. And most of the things we do will lower costs not just for the government, but also for the Medicare beneficiaries, and actually for the general public, because there's so much spillover from Medicare into what the private insurance companies learn. The next biggest item, and the biggest single program, is Social Security. There's a huge gap between what we raised from that 12.5% payroll tax and what we're paying in benefits. We got to close that gap. There's a million ways to do it. There's a plan called Social Security 2100, does it all by tax increases. There's a plan called the Social Security Reform Act, does it all by benefit changes. You can raise the retirement age, adjust the COLA, increase the amount of income subject to the cap. This is an algebra. I mean, it's basic arithmetic. The policymakers just need to be able to get together and do it. Here's some options. I'm not going to go through them, but hopefully we'll send the slide deck around so folks can see them. This is really just about political will. The bottom line is we can't save Social Security with the amount of payroll taxes we have and the size benefits we have. But we can through some very gradual changes to the retirement age, making the benefit formula a little bit more progressive, subjecting more income to the tax. These are all options. We got to move quickly, though. There's also other areas of spending that are not as big but are worth looking at, from farm subsidies and low-income programs to user fees and premiums, student loan program. There's a lot we can do to reform that. There's money there, but the big money is Social Security and Medicare on the spending side. But of course, spending is just half of the equation. We can also bring in more revenue, right? The first place I would look is something called tax expenditures. This is basically spending through the tax code, the various deductions, credits, exclusions, and other kinds of tax breaks. A lot of these look an awful lot like spending, but most of them are much more poorly distributed and create all sorts of distortions, like driving up healthcare costs, causing home values to be more, home costs to be more expensive and more leveraged, causing businesses to make bad investments because they're good from a tax perspective, And so closing a lot of these deductions or shrinking them or reforming them can save a lot of money. There's $1.5 trillion plus we spend on these tax breaks every year. We also, by the way, lose another $600 billion a year from taxes that are owed but not paid, right? So we don't even have to raise taxes. All we need to do is collect the taxes that people already owe. We're not going to get that full $600 billion, but if we could get $60 billion of that, that would be incredible, right? Over 10 years, that would get us, 10% of the way to what we need, just from collecting taxes that people already owe. And that's where the IRS funding really matters, right? And it's not about more audits, that's part of it, but it's about smarter audits, giving them the technology they need, and the experienced auditors that they need to kind of go after some of the big money, which is harder because the big money has a lot of lawyers behind it, giving people the support they need in the front end so they're not making as many mistakes that are costing the government money. So there's a lot we can do to close the tax gap. We can also just raise tax rates. This is the simplest option. I think it should be in the mix. It's not the first place I would go because I'm a tax reformer, so I'd rather make the tax code more efficient. But at the end of the day, you need to raise enough revenue to cover your costs, whether that's raising the individual income tax rates for higher earners or for everybody, whether it's raising the capital gains rates, the corporate rate. By the way, the corporate rate used to be 35. Paul Ryan, who was Republican Speaker, wanted it at 25. And Barack Obama agreed to 28. And so everybody knew the deal was going to be between 25 and 28. And then somehow it was 21. Somehow it kind of came out to 21%. So there's maybe some room. I don't think anybody wants to go back to 35. That would make us globally not competitive. But I think we could go to 24, 25, 26, and we're going to be okay. The United States is a very attractive place for businesses to establish and invest, and it'll be attractive at 25%. And then lastly, in the revenue section, I know Hank's going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm just going to breeze through it, is we can bring new revenues into the mix, whether it's value-added tax, carbon tax, which is sort of a double benefit. It would both raise revenue and help spur, I think, incentives to move us more quickly to green technology, especially in the energy space and carbon capture and clean vehicles, things like that. We could tax financial transactions, vehicle mileage. Wealth tax is something that's been talked about, right? So we can also look to other sources of revenue. That's basically our options. We either slow the growth of spending or we accelerate the growth of revenue, right? And in my opinion, we're probably going to have to do a little bit in each of these buckets. But if you go to members of Congress, if you go to a lot of the special interest groups, they may give you some non-solutions. It's a church, so I'm calling it non-solutions in the church, right? Somewhere else, I might call them something else. So, first of all, Congress and presidents have a habit of making things worse. This is all major pieces of fiscal legislation going back to 2001. The oranges are the good ones. Those are the ones that reduce the deficit. The blues are the bad ones. It's not even close, right? Way more bad ones than good ones. This doesn't even count the executive orders, which is the new vehicle to increase deficits because it's hidden. Congress has a habit of increasing deficits, and a lot of times they want to pretend they aren't. They say, well, this is current policy, or this is going to pay for itself. We hear this with tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. It's been something we've been hearing since the 80s. It's never been true. I mean, I'm sure somewhere, when we reduce the top rate from 90 to 70, that may be paid for itself or a lot of itself. But in the modern era, it hasn't been true. The more recent version of that, as we heard, is that public investments are going to pay for themselves. Again, there's a bridge somewhere I'm sure we can build that's going to pay for itself. But when you're spending $500 billion on public investments, you need a 5x return to pay for itself, or 6x, because we're not taxing the whole thing, right? That's not happening, especially when you get politics into it. So they pretend things don't cost money. They do. And there's a risk they're going to make things even worse. A bunch of tax cuts we did in 2017, to make their costs look smaller, they had them expire at the end of 2025. Democrats said, hey, that's a good idea. Let's do the same thing for healthcare expansion. And so now we have this big cliff at the end of 2025, where if we keep doing things, just continuing current policy, it's another $4 trillion of cost. And they may want to do worse than current policy because a lot of talk about expanding the child tax credit. A lot of people don't like the state and local tax deduction cap, the $10,000 cap. So this could be $5 trillion or $6 trillion. Now, a lot of people will say, sure, I want to fix the debt, I want to balance the budget, I want to do whatever, but you can't touch Social Security or Medicare or defense or veterans. Remember I said if you want to balance the budget just on spending, you got to cut spending 25% across the board. But if you take Social Security, Medicare, defense, and veterans off the table, you need to cut the rest of spending by 85%, right? So that basically means you eliminate the Medicaid program, you eliminate food stamps, you eliminate the EPA, you eliminate the State Department. I guess the congressmen can keep their jobs, and like that's about it, right? 85% is everything. Can't function the government on 15%. We similarly hear, okay, we're going to solve this by raising taxes on the rich, but we can't raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. And this administration has gone particularly ridiculous. They've said we can't even increase enforcement on people making less than $400,000. So if you're going to cheat on your taxes, just make sure you're only making $399,000 and you are good. The problem is that means instead of raising taxes by a third, which is already a lot, to do this only on people making over $400,000 and corporations for good measure, even though we know people pay some of that below $400,000, I counted all corporations, you'd have to raise those taxes by 74%. That's actually worse than it sounds because it's actually literally impossible because it would mean, I said tax cuts don't pay for themselves. This would get taxes to the point that tax cuts would pay for themselves. If you raise taxes that high, there's some maximum amount of taxes, right? If we taxed everyone 100%, nobody would work and it would lose revenue. This would get us close to that place where we were getting no revenue, right? We'd be on the wrong side of what we call the Laffer curve. And so it is literally impossible to balance the budget just from taxes on the rich, literally impossible to balance the budget just from this small portion of spending. And I know stabilizing the debt looks more reasonable because it's only 33% of each, but it turns out that's actually very, 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 very large. So we're not going to solve this by taking things off the table. We're also can't pretend this is going to solve itself. Most of our challenges at this point are demographic, and most of those demographics were sort of preset 60 years ago, right? If everybody goes home and has kids tomorrow in like spades, it's 18 years before they're any good to the economy, right? Probably more. Immigration can help a little. I got a six-year-old, so she's only got 12 years till she's useful. Immigration can help on the margins, but fundamentally, it's not big enough to kind of close this gap. And the problem with immigrants is they also get old, right? So it's a stopgap solution. We can't wish this away. It's pre-baked. And we can't sort of come up with these newfangled theories that assume there is no problem. Like my new favorite one is the modern monetary theory, which basically says debt doesn't matter, deficits don't matter unless they cause inflation, and there's never going to be inflation. Well, that didn't really work out so well, right? And they might have known that if they had looked at any point in history where a country tried to print money to get its way out of its debt, right? We didn't end up like this. We had 7% inflation. We were not hyperinflation. But that's the situation when, if you were to sort of fully adopt this idea of MMT, that you just borrow infinite amounts. So we can't wish our way out of this, can't print our way out of this, we can't grow our way out of this, and we can't take everything off the table. We actually need to start doing some tough stuff. And by the way, now, just when you can rely on Congress to disappoint you, they disappoint you by not disappointing you, and they actually didn't shut down. When I made this slide, I thought they were going to shut down. But had they shut down, that doesn't save any money either. When they shut down, they still pay the federal employees just later. So it just wastes money, it doesn't save money. I think everybody knows that's not a solution, but in case we're in a shutdown, I wanted to have a slide on that. So thank you all very much, and I know we're going to talk about now, and Hank's going to talk about the VAT.
Right. How do you feel about all of this, huh? So, my world is taxes. That's where I've been all of my life. And it's very interesting when we start thinking about alternative ways to raise money through taxes, there are 163 countries in the world that impose something called a value-added tax. We are the only one that doesn't. A value-added tax, just so you understand what it is, it's essentially a sales tax that's collected along the production line so that the opportunities to avoid the tax are minimized because of the way that the system is administered. But think about it as a national consumption tax. Now, the Senate once considered this about 10 years ago, I think, Mark? No, probably a little bit more. And the Senate voted 86-12 that they would never have a VAT in the United States. Others have talked about it, and they've said, Larry Summers, a name you may know, has said, the Democrats think that the VAT is regressive, and the Republicans think it's a cash cow. And until they reverse their positions, we're not going to get it. So those are sort of the big picture things. But it turns out that a value-added tax, which is a consumption tax, and we need to understand exactly what a consumption tax is. In a consumption tax, the return from saving is not subject to tax. That the only thing that's subject to tax is consumption. You learned in macroeconomics, income equals consumption plus savings. Consumption equals income minus savings. So one thing to think about in the background when you consider this alternative tax system is income from savings is not taxed. You have to do something about that. But it turns out to be a relatively efficient way of being able to produce taxes. Now, or rather, to be able to produce revenues. Now, people have said, well, but it's terribly regressive. And the answer is yes, of course, if you do nothing about it and impose a 5% tax on every purchase, that's absolutely true. So what countries did the early adopters of value-added taxes put in lots of exemptions. They said, well, we really shouldn't tax education costs. We shouldn't tax food. We shouldn't tax drugs, blah, blah, blah. And then you had the definitional questions. This is literally true. In Australia, pastry is subject to tax, bread is not. There's a 60-page opinion from the highest court in Australia determining what ciabatta is. I mean, who needs that? But the fact of the matter is you can deal with the regressivity issue by a rather different means. And New Zealand actually is the country that's the gold standard here. We have remarkable data in this country with respect to how much money is spent on various items at various income classes. And so you can say, what I want to do is exempt expenditures for food, let's say. And we know that at an income level of X, the average amount that's spent is Y. And so instead of trying to go through and determine, is this particular sale taxable or not, what you do is you give people a credit card equal to the rebate that they would get. Now, they may go buy dope. You don't know. But the way that you deal with the regressivity problem can be, it can be dealt with. In a country this size, it's a little bit more difficult than in a country like New Zealand. But we know that we can deal with regressivity, and the point is that it is a huge revenue raiser. A broad-based VAT in this country would raise about $50 billion a year per point. That's a lot of money. 5% VAT is $250 billion a year. You saw these numbers that Mark had up here. Thinking creatively about the tax system. It's easy to think creatively. Thinking politically about the tax system is maybe the most frustrating thing in the world. And I know because I've spent years trying to do it. You just can't get the members off things. Mark mentioned something called tax expenditures. Well, a tax expenditure by definition is a provision of the Internal Revenue Code that's not necessary to measure income properly. It does something else. And so, for example, if we have accelerated depreciation at a level that's higher than standard or economic depreciation, we're giving a break to those people. And the break to those people is, in fact, a subsidy. The interesting thing about this, if you go back and look at the history of tax expenditures and their analysis, and the great scholar who did this was a man named Stanley Surrey, what you learned was The tax guys figured it out. If you look at the budget, you've got to go through an authorization process and an appropriations process. But if you do it through the tax system, it's the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee. Bring it on. And as soon as people began to realize that, then we began to see essentially the erosion of the tax base as congressmen doing what congressmen do, want to take care of their constituents, and we do all of this spending now that's being done through the tax system in a way where we cannot evaluate what the results are, and we know that there are terrible inefficiencies. We can't enforce it, but yet the system that we have, no matter how much folks can say, gee, it isn't right to do it this way, the system that we have promotes this because it's the easy way out. You don't have to go through the spending and appropriations process. So, bottom line, there's a lot of things that could happen in my old world, in the tax world, that could ameliorate a lot of this stuff. More enforcement is obviously a good thing, but redesign of the programs, elimination of tax expenditures, is another way to do things. And of that, I mean, that's just a huge revenue source. Back in 1993, when I was working when I was working on the Hill, and by the way, in 1993, we passed the largest tax increase in the history of the country. It's $846 billion. George Bush came into office with a $1.2 trillion surplus. Alan Greenspan testified that he was really worried if we had a surplus, we wouldn't have any national debt and we couldn't establish an interest rate. Well, he got his wish. It didn't happen. We can do these kinds of things, but they are difficult to do. They require political will, and they also require, I think, on the part of the electorate, a little bit more of an understanding of what the real trade-offs are here, so that these guys just can't get away with it all the time. This is a dreadful picture, and I've got to say, I don't see a lot of ways out of this picture over the short term. They're going to end up doing this CR again. The tax cuts that expire are shown as expiring in all of these numbers. Give me a break. I mean, that's $3.2 billion, or $3.2 trillion over 10 years. So it's not a happy picture. I'd like to end the story by saying, hey, everything's going to be rosy. We end the story by saying, this is really hard. And people have to understand it, and they have to be able to have the courage to do what needs to get done, and you need to make your representatives do that because we're in a democracy. That's the end of the happy story. So I think we got time for questions. Surely we haven't stunned everybody into silence.
We have time for questions, but are there any questions out there?
No.
Everybody's got it, right? Before we go to questions, guys, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You packed an awful lot in there. Thank you. I know we have questions. I know we have some online. Just a reminder, use the Q&A feature in your Zoom window, and Megan will read those out into the room. But let's get started here. Okay, right now.
We always hear of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And in today's environment of just dog-eat-dog politics, can we really expect it to remain nonpartisan?
Short answer, yes. Now you want a more expansive answer? Let me get to you. We have two nonpartisan committees or organizations on the Hill. One is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office was founded in 1974 as a product of the Congressional Budget Act. The director of the CBO is appointed by the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate for a 4-year term. The legislation specifies that that's a non-political appointment. And then the staff of the CBO, I think there's 275 roughly, I think, on the staff, somewhere like that. They are all professionals that are chosen because of their expertise. I mean, people can be cynical about that, but if you've lived in that world, you know that this is played straight down the line. The other side of the equation is the Joint Committee on Taxation. Joint Committee on Taxation was founded in 1926 because there's some scandals that had happened in the Internal Revenue Service. The Joint Committee itself is comprised of the 3 ranking members of the Ways and Means and Finance Committees and the 2 ranking minority members. The responsibility of the Joint Committee on Taxation is to provide Congress with economic revenue and technical advice with respect to all tax legislation. The Chief of Staff is appointed by the Joint Committee. And that is also, to be honest about it, that's not quite as nonpartisan a job as the CBO is, but it's pretty nonpartisan because the Joint Committee is responsible for both sides of the aisle. So they really have to be able to give advice and be trusted on the Republican and Democratic side. The Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee does not have a term. Some have been there for a very long time, others have not. The staff of the Joint Committee is about 55 now, of whom about 30 are PhD economists, and the others are either tax experts or tax accountants, and they're responsible for providing this information to Congress. Frankly, you couldn't get away with it if you were being partisan. Things couldn't function. So I think it's certainly appropriate to ask hard questions about how both CBO and JCT get to where they get, but I have total confidence in the objectivity that's brought to the table.
Yeah, I'll just add, so CBO's main job is to estimate legislation. And every single estimate they've ever done has been wrong because,
absolutely.
Because they don't have a time machine and they don't have a crystal ball, right? And so they are estimates. So they will either be too high or too low. Their job is not to tell you. And so a lot of people get frustrated because they say, you said this program was going to cost $3 billion and it actually cost $4 billion. Their job is not to predict their future. Their job is to give you an unbiased estimate that is the center of a range of plausible outcomes. And they do that professionally, and they do that in a nonpartisan way, and they do that with absolutely no agenda or no interest in the outcome. The only exception is CBO does have an interest in its own budget. That's the only time CBO ever takes any position.
And so does the Joint Committee.
Yeah.
So does the Joint Committee.
Next one's here.
Hey, yeah, thanks for your time. I'm kind of asking both of you to kind of put your bond trader hat on, even though it's not your profession. Do you see yields spiking? I mean, over the next 3 to 4 years, just because I think in the forecast they're saying anywhere from 4 to 5% on a 5 or 10-year Treasury. But do you see the situation where it bumps up to 6 or 7 or even 8 if we get into kind of a debt crisis? And just your thoughts on that.
What was the question?
All right, do we see yields spiking? So yields already are spiking. Let's start with that. Granted, we were in a global pandemic, but if we go back to 2020, the 3-month was at 0. The 10-year was at 1% at some points, but even kind of on the other end of it, early 2021, it was at 2%. Now they're at 5.5 and 4.7. 4.7 is already almost a percentage point higher than CBO thought it would be. So I think yields already are spiking. The question is, are they going to spike further? And I could go either way. On the one hand, inflation is coming down, which should mean eventually the Federal Reserve is going to lower its near-term rate, which should affect it. We have an aging global population. We have a lot of global wealth, and those things should push down rates. On the other hand, inflation isn't solved, and there's, I think, more anxiety that inflation could come back. We have an aging of the aged, which means when you have an aging population, you have less spenders and more savers, and that pushes up interest rates. But if you have an aging of the aged, you have more dissavers as people are withdrawing from their retirements, and that may push down, that may push up interest rates. Global income's going up, so there's more consumers around the world. And lastly, maybe the one that I worry about most is global sovereign debt is going up, not just US. US matters, but global. And that higher sovereign debt is going to push up interest rates. So where, in other words, there's pressures in both directions. I tend to think we're near peak for now. Maybe we'll get to 5%, but I tend to think we're near peak and then we'll come down a little bit. But I think that sort of those underlying pressures are long-term, and so we'll be back on an upward track. But I also didn't think we'd be at 4.7 now. So it might be, once we get this momentum, markets start to freak out, and we do have much higher to go.
Okay, we're going to take a question from the online group. Everybody say hi to Megan McGee-Bonta, our new program manager. Megan is the proxy for our online audience. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. From our online audience, I find it curious that Congress members continue to get paid even when the government shuts down. If Congress members' pay is tied to the government staying open, could that have an impact on the motivation of Congress finding solutions?
So it turns out it is a constitutional requirement that you pay members of Congress, as much as many of us chagrin that. They did come up with an idea, no budget, no pay, a few years ago, that was able to defer that pay. And so we could do the same thing, and I think there's been talks of doing the same thing, no funding and your pay is deferred, which would put them in the same position as federal employees who have essentially deferred spending. I think it's worth doing because it creates some accountability. The problem is most of the members of Congress, especially in the Senate, are independently wealthy enough that it's not going to matter that much. And you may be punishing exactly the wrong ones if you take away their pay. So it's not a catch-all, but sure, let's give it a try.
Hank, anything to add on that? Okay.
Can we add one more here from our
Yeah.
online audience? Okay. Has the process become more politicized over the years? Could you speak to the role of lobbyists?
Talk about that first.
Yeah, a little bit, sure.
Go ahead. You've talked to a lot of lobbyists.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, plainly. I'll just, a way of describing it is just from my own experience. Back in the day when tax legislation was being considered, the chief of staff of the Joint Committee, early on a man named Colin Stam, and after that a man named Larry Woodworth, with the Joint Committee staff, basically sat down with the chairs of the tax writing committees, and they decided what they were going to do. And by and large, the technical expertise that resided in the Joint Committee carried the day. Today, you have an enormous proliferation of staff at lots of levels, and again in the tax world. The Ways and Means Committee majority and minority staffs have grown enormously in size, but more importantly, the members have taken on staff to deal with these tax issues. And I don't want to be too judgmental about it, but when a 23-year-old comes in and tries to tell somebody who's been doing this all his life what the world ought to look like, you get a little skeptical. And the 23-year-old also influences member. Because you remember, these members have enormous amounts of responsibility that they've got to deal with. And so, to the extent that they rely on their staff for good advice, which they have to do and should do, this becomes a problem when you get proliferation of all of the actors. And so the process itself has just become much more complicated and much more difficult to achieve consensus around solutions, even agreement on which way we ought to go. So the short answer is yes, the proliferation of staff, the access of lobbyists, because when staff proliferates, guess who the lobbyists go to see? They go to see the 23-year-old, and they take them to dinner, and they make a nice pitch. And the 23-year-old goes to the member and says, hey, we ought to do this. And the check in the system, which still exists, are in fact these nonpartisan groups, but the system's become much more difficult to deal with.
All right, I saw your hand here.
Mark, I'm sorry. Mark, my question is directed to Mark, but Hank, feel free. The vast majority of your information seems to me, not an economist, far from that, is all about, and I'm choosing my words carefully, squeezing money from the people who provide money to run the federal government, taxpayers and corporations. In a sense, it seems to me you might be suggesting that trying to rein in government spending is almost a fool's errand. I mean, you mentioned, we read all the time, for instance, about, the Navy is building ships that even the Navy doesn't want. The Air Force is building planes that don't fly. It just goes on and on. Medical care in the United States, which one you mentioned and know a little bit about, we spend more than I think the next 5 countries in the entire world, and our outcomes are worse. And they're declining. They're not even getting better. So there's just so much waste. It's frustrating as a taxpayer to think that we give them more money. I'm reminded of something I think Everett Dirksen, a congressman from Ohio, said many, many years ago. Don't give them more money. It only encourages them. So I'll stop at that point.
Sure. So I'll say I don't think that's a fair characterization of my presentation, and that I think I spent a lot of time on spending. There's tremendous amount of waste in defense and in non-defense, and as I mentioned, the appropriators have basically been unleashed for the last few years, and so I think the caps we put in place in the Fiscal Responsibility Act are a good first step, and we got to go further. As I said, we need to get Medicare costs under control because it's very wasteful. The largest spending program is Social Security, and anybody that says don't touch Social Security, which, by the way, the current and the previous president have both said don't touch Social Security, they are essentially endorsing a 23% across-the-board cut in 10 years. So I think we absolutely need to do a ton on spending. But here's the reality of the situation. We also waste a lot of money through the tax code. We have a lot of tax breaks that are really inefficient. We have a lot of people that owe taxes that aren't paying them. And while the idea of sort of starve the beast has some appeal, it hasn't worked in practice. In 2017, we passed a huge tax cut. That was followed by a huge bipartisan spending increase in 2018. Every time we've cut taxes, instead of kind of starving the spending, what it's done is it said, we can borrow for this, so you can borrow for that. And so I'm worried about this situation that, look, giving tax cuts is fun. I get it. Like, new spending programs are fun. That's what politicians want to do. They want to go and say, look, we made this for you. We gave you that. But nobody's thinking about the trade-offs. And we are in so deep that I think we're beyond the point that this is savable, looking either only at the spending side or only at the revenue side. I think we need to look at everything.
All right. Just to clarify, this one came in earlier, so this is not in reaction or response to your question. But someone asked, why is military spending defense budget off the table? This seems like a big piece of the pie that could have had a significant impact on reducing debt.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't be. So the Fiscal Responsibility Act agreed to, they made it very convoluted, but essentially what they agreed to was a freeze on non-defense and a 3% increase on defense. I would have done a freeze on both, but I wasn't in the room for the negotiation. And then for year 2, limit both of them to 1%. And so I think people don't realize that there actually are limits on the defense budget. They come in stronger in year 2. We should be able to go further than that. The defense budget has an incredible amount of waste in several areas. One is weapon systems. Look, we should have the best weapons in the world, but they shouldn't be based on what parts are manufactured in what congressional district. They should be based on like what we need to kill terrorists, right? Or whatever it is the military is doing. That's not how it works. So there's a huge amount we can rein in there. Second, the bureaucracy. There is tremendous amount of unnecessary layers in the military. Third, and this is the most politically hard part, but it's also the part that's growing the fastest, is the benefits. We have public schools on military bases in amazing school districts in the United States. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We have commissaries that everybody thinks is really fun, but like they're not a good use of taxpayer money when you have local stores. And that's before talking about the health and retirement programs, which are the real cost drivers of the long run. So we got to be looking at all parts of defense. And then there's this bigger strategic question of like, should we be doing less, right? That's that's sort of first a foreign policy question, but you need to think of that in the context of money. So defense shouldn't be off the table. It needs to be on the table along with everything else.
It seems to me that at bottom these problems are caused by politics. I suspect everybody would agree with that. And I wonder if addressing the problem through politics, for example, let's suppose that we had a presidential candidate that really pushed hard for term limits, so the power that these people had would be reduced. Let me just give you one interesting comparison. I have family in Switzerland. Switzerland spends just about exactly the same percentage of GDP has the same amount of revenue, around 29% of GDP that we do. They have much more comprehensive social programs. They have no deficits, and the president of Switzerland serves for 1 year. Nobody even knows who it is. Their legislatures, it's a very big deal. Their legislators are in the legislature for a while, and then they go back to their homes and they go back to their businesses and professions. If we had something more like that, wouldn't things change a lot? And wouldn't it be quite a popular way for politicians to campaign for the presidency?
Do you want to take it?
No.
I'll say that. I'll say a couple of things. The one is that our budget deficits are not exclusively, but primarily the symptom of a broken political system. And we cannot wait to fix the disease to treat the symptoms. We got to treat the symptoms because, you saw my hockey stick graph, but we should be trying to treat the disease too. And we actually do a separate thing called Fix Us. Underneath, we created a sort of a political reform project, even though that's not part of the budget, because so many people looking at the budget agree that this is primarily and first and foremost a political problem. One thing that's sort of easy that you can do within the current political system that a little bit tries to take this outside of politics is a commission. And I know commissions seem like, well, it's just a kick the can move to say you're solving the problem without solving the problem. But the truth of the matter is, I think it's probably our best way forward. There's been a lot of success in the past. In 1983, we had a commission that helped save Social Security. In the 80s and 90s through 2005, we had commissions that closed military bases that were open for no other reason than there was a congressman or congresswoman that didn't want them closed. Commissions came up with new ideas for tax reform that ultimately helped inform some of the best parts of the 2017 tax bill. Commissions helped us rearrange our bureaucracy after the 9/11 attack. Commissions have been successful in the past. And Simpson-Bowles, a commission that I served on, which didn't get its recommendations enacted, nonetheless completely changed the conversation in Washington for the next several years. Got President Obama and Speaker Boehner to 3 times attempt high-level negotiations that almost led to a grand bargain, led us to the Budget Control Act, led us to many of the other offsets that we used. And so while commission is it's sort of the worst approach except for all the others, I think it's worth doing because it takes some of the politics out of it just for a little while and lets Democrats and Republicans sit together with a common goal, not trying to beat each other over the head, but trying to solve problems.
Question here.
So I'm interested in your opinion. If you had to guess, what would be the headline of the same presentation made here in 20 years from now? Because the problem seems to be well understood, the potential solutions, not trying to oversimplify them, but understood as well. The political will is more in question. What do you think the discussion is going to be in 20 years, knowing everything you know?
I don't know how to think about it.
Well, I'm a short-term pessimist, but I'm optimistic enough to think that we will have solved some of this in 20 years. I think that there's enough deadlines in front of us, the Medicare Trust Fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, interest rates. I think we will have solved at least some of this, at least enough to stumble along. I think we probably won't have solved all of this. And so I think in 20 years, what did I title this? Because that would help me. But I think the theme will be, don't make me do titles in this spot, but I think the theme will be, why is our growth so slow and our interest is eating all of our gains? I think that will be the theme. I think that we'll be kind of stuck in this area, that we've solved some of the problems, enough to survive, enough that we don't have a crisis, but not enough to thrive. And so we'll see very slow growth, and the gains that we do have to growth are essentially going to interest payments.
One more from the online audience.
What administration has had a balanced budget, and why was that administration successful?
The last administration to get us balanced budget was the Clinton administration. This was a long process that actually started in the Reagan administrations, right? So first Reagan came in and cut taxes and boosted defense spending. 1981 was a disaster for the budget. But then from 1982 to 1988, Reagan passed several pieces of deficit-reducing legislation, working mostly with Democratic Congresses. And then George H.W. Bush came in and had the 1990 budget deal. And then Bill Clinton built on that in 1993, just Democrats, and then 1997 in negotiations with Newt Gingrich. And by the way, there was a second set of negotiations that almost led them to save Social Security. If it hadn't been for the Lewinsky scandal, we probably would not be talking about Social Security insolvency now, just all that other bad stuff. But Social Security would be good. How did they do it? They kind of kept working at it, little by little. They reduced spending. They did the budget caps. They found waste in Medicare. They raised revenue. Some of it was cutting tax breaks. Some of it was raising rates. They looked for trade-offs. They looked for areas where they could create new efficient programs like the Children's Health Insurance Program or the EITC that were relatively inexpensive compared to the pay-fors. And he benefited from a period of really favorable demographics and strong economic growth. Anything you want to add?
Yeah.
We have one more here.
Why can't the people who are neglecting to pay their taxes be found and have their taxes collected?
What was the question?
Why can't we find the people that aren't paying their taxes and enforce the tax code better?
It sounds so simple.
It's a wonderful question. Well, part of it is lack of resources, and nobody wants to empower the Internal Revenue Service actually to do it. I mean, we have data about how much is unpaid, and we've got a pretty good idea of where it is, but if you don't have the enforcement capacity, it's very difficult to do it. I'm not saying that's Pardon me?
Can the enforcers be paid by the taxes?
Look, I mean, there's
This is actually an idea that I've been pushing, by the way.
Yeah, that's not an absurd idea at all,
Yeah.
but that leads to some other serious problems.
So here's what I'll say. You're never going to have 100% compliance, right? That's a given. But if you look at the parts of the tax code that are closest to it, it's the parts where we withhold the money in advance,
Yeah.
and it's reported. So it's wages. Wages have very, very high compliance. Very few people don't pay taxes on their wage income. Why? Because their employer's withholding it and reporting it, right? And so all you have to do is reconcile at the end. Where there's decent compliance, and it's gotten better, is capital gains and stuff, right? Nobody's withholding, but it does get reported so long as if you're, have a Fidelity account that's reported. If you have a piece of art, that's not. But most of it's reported, and so it's pretty good. The bad stuff comes very largely from self-employed and small and medium-sized businesses. The largest businesses have huge accounting firms and have to do regular audits. But my wife is a photographer. She's a sole proprietor. She just puts her stuff in Excel. And if she lied in that Excel, nobody would ever know. Never. Because there's no one recording it. There's no information reporting at all. If it looked ridiculous, the IRS might enforce it. If she said, I spent $40,000 on a camera, they might say that's a little bit weird, right? But within reason, they're not going to question. And so it's the totally self-reported income that's the biggest gap. That doesn't mean we can't make improvements. The one big improvement is fund the IRS to improve its technology, to improve its oversight. That's very politically controversial, it turns out. We gave them $80 billion, and there's already agreement to pare back a quarter of that. Another is to increase the information they have. One way we can do that was also very, very controversial was to have banks start giving even very general information to the government about if it's a business account, just how much did the person put in and how much did they take out in a given year, right? And if somebody put in $1 million and took out $800,000 and they're reporting $20,000 of income, the IRS can say red flag. That doesn't seem right. But that got pitched as, Big Brother trying to invade your privacy. And so there's the fact that it's legitimately hard, and there's the politics that makes it even harder.
It sounds like my cash-only barber could solve our deficit right now. Is that? So we are at time, and I want to honor everybody's evening. I do want to ask for one more thing from each of you as quickly as you can do it. In an age of increasing dis and misinformation, where can people look for good news on this subject in the years to come?
Well, here.
crfb.org, right? Everybody write that down.
And if you want to play games, they've got a wonderful, wonderful interactive program where you can decide what you want to do with discretionary spending and see the effect that it has on anything. Just go to the website and play with it, and the frustration is going to be not much, but at least you can do your own budget and see what the effects are. Yeah. They have wonderful stuff.
In all honesty, so we have a few interactive tools. We have one that you can build your own Social Security reform, and we've used this in high schools, and we've used this with literal members of Congress that have written legislation based on this tool. So it's kind of covers from high schooler all the way down to member of Congress, right? And we also put out reports at all different levels. So I definitely recommend our website, CBO's website, Government Accountability Office, exactly. CRS. Twitter, if you can sort through the garbage, there's sometimes something interesting on there.
Ladies and gentlemen, Hank Gutman and Mark Goldwine.
Thank you.